Queen Isabella stood at the grand window of Ravenshollow Palace, watching the morning mist rise from the ancient gardens below. Her reflection in the glass showed a woman who had aged beyond her 52 years, worry lines etched deep around her emerald eyes. The weight of the crown she wore daily seemed heavier with each passing month, but today felt different. Today, everything would change. The marble floors echoed with her footsteps as she paced the royal chambers, her silk gown rustling with each turn. 28 years of marriage to King Marcus had taught her to read the subtle signs of his moods, and lately those signs had become increasingly troubling. The late-night phone calls he thought she couldn't hear, the mysterious meetings with advisors behind closed doors, and most concerning of all, the way he avoided her gaze during their public appearances. Their love story had once been the fairy tale the kingdom celebrated. Marcus, then crown prince, had swept her off her feet at a diplomatic ball in neighboring Aldermere. She was the daughter of a respected duke, beautiful and intelligent, everything a future queen should be. Their courtship had been passionate and genuine, filled with stolen moments in palace gardens and secret letters passed between their kingdoms. When they married in the Cathedral of Saints, millions watched as they exchanged vows that seemed unbreakable. But fairy tales Isabella had learned were stories told to children. Reality was far more complex and often cruel. The early years of their marriage had been blissful, especially after the birth of their son, Prince Alexander, now 25 and heir to the throne. Alexander had inherited his father's strong jaw and his mother's quick wit, making him beloved by both the royal family and the people of Ravenshollow. Their daughter, Princess Victoria, arrived 3 years later, bringing joy and laughter to the palace walls. At 22, she had grown into a spirited young woman with her mother's beauty and an independent streak that often worried the royal advisors. Victoria's recent engagement to Lord Edmund of Westfield had been announced just months ago, and the wedding preparations were already underway. However, beneath the surface of royal perfection, cracks had begun to show. The pressure of ruling a modern kingdom while maintaining ancient traditions had taken its toll on Marcus. The media scrutinized every decision, every public appearance, every word spoken at state functions. Economic challenges in recent years had made the monarchy's role more crucial than ever, and Marcus felt the weight of every citizen's hopes and fears. Isabella had tried to be the supportive wife and queen the kingdom expected, but she sensed her husband pulling away. Their conversations had become formal, almost scripted, as if they were playing roles rather than being genuine with each other. She missed the man who used to surprise her with wildflowers picked from the palace gardens, who would sneak away from state dinners to dance with her on empty terraces under starlit skies. The morning sun climbed higher, casting golden light across the ornate furniture and priceless paintings that adorned their private quarters. Isabella remembered when these rooms had felt like a sanctuary, a place where she and Marcus could be themselves, away from the watchful eyes of the court and the public. Now, they felt like a beautiful prison where two strangers happened to sleep in the same bed. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Lady Margaret, her most trusted lady-in-waiting, entered with the morning's correspondence. Margaret had served the royal family for over 15 years and had become more friend than servant to Isabella. Her discretion was absolute and her loyalty unwavering. "Your Majesty, the morning briefings are ready, and Lord Chancellor Harrison wishes to speak with you about the upcoming state visit from Valdoria," Margaret said, her voice gentle but concerned. She had noticed the Queen's troubled state in recent weeks. Isabella nodded, forcing herself back into the role of Queen. There were duties to fulfill, responsibilities that couldn't be ignored, regardless of her personal turmoil. The state visit from Valdoria was particularly important, as trade agreements between the kingdoms could significantly impact Ravenshollow's economic future. As she prepared for the day ahead, Isabella caught herself wondering if Marcus would join her for the evening's formal dinner, or if he would find another excuse to avoid spending time together. Their public appearances had become performances, carefully choreographed displays of royal unity that felt increasingly hollow. The palace staff moved through their routines with practiced efficiency, unaware of the storm brewing in their queen's heart. The gardens continued to bloom, the flags flew proudly from the towers, and life in the kingdom proceeded as it always had. But Isabella knew that sometimes the most devastating earthquakes began with the smallest tremors, barely noticeable until everything began to crumble. She straightened her shoulders, adjusted her pearl necklace, and prepared to face another day of royal duties, while silently wondering how much longer she could maintain the facade. The truth, whatever it might be, was pressing against the carefully constructed walls of their royal life, threatening to break through with a force that could shake the very foundations of the monarchy. The morning ahead promised meetings with ministers, reviews of charitable organizations under royal patronage, and preparations for upcoming ceremonial events. Each task required her full attention and royal composure, skills she had perfected over decades of service to the crown. Yet underneath it all, a growing sense of unease suggested that the comfortable patterns of royal life were about to be disrupted in ways she couldn't yet imagine. As she walked toward the throne room for her first appointment, Isabella couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking toward a precipice, though she had no idea how far the fall might be or what would remain when she reached the bottom. The grand ballroom of Raven's Hollow Palace sparkled under the light of 1,000 crystal chandeliers as the kingdom's elite gathered for the annual harvest celebration. Isabella moved gracefully through the crowd, her sapphire gown catching the light as she exchanged pleasantries with ambassadors, nobles, and distinguished guests. Her smile was perfect, practiced through years of royal training, but those who knew her well might have noticed the slight tension around her eyes. King Marcus stood across the room, resplendent in his formal military uniform, adorned with medals and ceremonial ribbons. To observers, he appeared every inch the confident monarch, engaging in animated discussions about trade policies and international relations. However, Isabella noticed how his gaze occasionally drifted toward the grand staircase, as if he were expecting someone. Princess Victoria swept into the ballroom fashionably late, her presence immediately commanding attention. Her burgundy dress was modern yet appropriate for royal protocol, and her recent engagement ring caught the light as she waved to the assembled guests. Lord Edmund followed closely behind, his devotion to the princess evident in his protective stance and adoring glances. Prince Alexander approached his mother, offering his arm as they made their way toward the high table. "Mother, you seem distracted tonight," he observed quietly, his voice filled with genuine concern. Alexander had always been perceptive, a quality that would serve him well as future king. "Just the usual concerns, darling," Isabella replied, squeezing his arm affectionately. "There's so much to coordinate for the Valdorian state visit next week." It wasn't entirely a lie, though. It wasn't the complete truth either. The weight of unspoken worries pressed against her chest like a physical burden. The orchestra began playing, and couples moved toward the dance floor for the traditional opening waltz. Marcus approached Isabella with the formal bow required by protocol, extending his hand for their ceremonial first dance. As they moved together across the polished marble floor, decades of practice made their steps perfectly synchronized. Yet Isabella felt as though she were dancing with a stranger. "You look beautiful tonight," Marcus murmured, the words carrying the tone of duty rather than genuine admiration. His hand rested appropriately on her waist, maintaining the proper distance expected of royal couples in public. "Thank you, Your Majesty," Isabella responded formally, using his title rather than his name as she might have in more intimate moments. The formality felt like a wall between them, growing higher with each passing day. As they danced, Isabella's mind wandered to earlier times when their movements had been spontaneous expressions of joy rather than carefully choreographed performances. She remembered their honeymoon in the countryside estate, where they had danced barefoot on the terrace while rain fell softly around them, laughing as they tried to stay in rhythm with music only they could hear. The song ended, and they separated with polite applause from the gathered guests. Marcus immediately excused himself to speak with the Valdorian ambassador, leaving Isabella to manage the social expectations of the evening. She moved from group to group, discussing charitable initiatives, cultural events, and the various concerns of the noble families who formed the backbone of the kingdom's social structure. Lady Margaret appeared at her elbow with updates about the evening's schedule and gentle reminders about upcoming obligations. "Your Majesty, the photographer would like a formal family portrait before the evening concludes," she whispered discreetly. Isabella nodded, though the thought of posing for another perfect family photograph felt exhausting. These images would appear in newspapers and magazines worldwide, reinforcing the image of royal stability and happiness. The irony wasn't lost on her that some of life's greatest deceptions were hidden behind the most beautiful facades. Prince Alexander was engaged in serious conversation with several young nobles about environmental conservation efforts, his passion for sustainable development evident in his animated gestures. His dedication to meaningful causes had always made Isabella proud, and she hoped his generation could bring positive changes to the monarchy's role in modern society. Princess Victoria, meanwhile, was entertaining a group of foreign dignitaries with stories about her recent humanitarian work in developing regions. Her natural charisma and genuine compassion made her a valuable asset to the royal family's public image, though Isabella worried about her daughter's tendency toward spontaneous decisions that sometimes challenged protocol. As the evening progressed, Isabella found herself observing Marcus more carefully. His conversations seemed strained, and he frequently glanced toward the palace's private entrances as if expecting an important arrival. When Lord Chancellor Harrison approached him with what appeared to be urgent news, Marcus's face grew noticeably pale before he quickly composed himself. The Chancellor whispered something that made Marcus's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. Isabella had seen that expression before, usually when dealing with particularly challenging political situations or family crises. Her instincts, honed by years of reading the subtle undercurrents of palace life, told her that whatever news Harrison had delivered was significant. Marcus excused himself from his conversation and walked briskly toward one of the side exits, his departure so smooth that most guests didn't notice. However, Isabella's trained eye caught the urgency in his stride and the way his hands clenched slightly at his sides, a nervous habit from their early marriage that she had learned to recognize. The absence of the king didn't go unnoticed by the more astute members of the court. Isabella felt the subtle shift in the room's atmosphere as people began to whisper behind gloved hands and fans. Royal protocol required her to continue hosting as if nothing unusual had occurred. But internally, her anxiety began to escalate. Lady Margaret appeared again, this time with a concerned expression. "Your Majesty, His Majesty, requests your presence in the blue study at your earliest convenience," she said quietly, using coded language that indicated the matter was both urgent and private. Isabella's heart began to race, though her expression remained perfectly composed. The blue study was Marcus's private office, used only for the most sensitive discussions involving family or state security. Whatever had prompted this summons was serious enough to interrupt the kingdom's most important social event of the season. She gracefully extracted herself from her current conversation, citing the need to check on arrangements for the evening's final ceremonies. As she made her way through the palace corridors toward the blue study, each step felt heavier than the last. The cheerful sounds of the celebration grew distant, replaced by the echoing of her heels on marble floors that had witnessed centuries of royal secrets. The blue study sat in quiet shadows, illuminated only by the flickering flames from the ornate fireplace and a single desk lamp casting golden circles on the mahogany surface. Isabella entered to find Marcus standing with his back to her, staring out the tall windows toward the moonlit gardens. His formal uniform jacket hung on a chair nearby, and his shirt sleeves were rolled up in a gesture of informal vulnerability she hadn't seen from him in months. "You asked to see me," Isabella said softly, closing the heavy door behind her. The sound of the latch clicking seemed unusually loud in the tense silence that filled the room. Marcus turned slowly, and Isabella was shocked by the transformation in his appearance. The confident king who had been commanding the ballroom just minutes earlier had been replaced by a man who looked exhausted and haunted. His usually perfectly groomed hair was disheveled from running his hands through it, and his eyes held an expression of barely contained anguish. "Isabella, please sit," he said, gesturing toward the leather chairs positioned near the fireplace. His voice carried a weight that made her stomach tighten with apprehension. "We need to discuss something that I should have told you long ago." She remained standing, her royal training kicking in as a defense mechanism against whatever revelation was coming. "What's happened, Marcus? Is it about the Valdorian negotiations, the economic summit?" Her mind raced through various political scenarios that might require such urgent attention. "No, it's not about politics or diplomacy," Marcus replied, moving to pour himself a glass of brandy from the crystal decanter on his desk. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted the glass. "It's about us, about our marriage, about choices I made that I thought would protect our family." Isabella felt the blood drain from her face. 28 years of marriage had taught her to recognize the prelude to life-changing conversations. She slowly lowered herself into the chair he had indicated, her sapphire gown pooling around her like still water. Marcus sat across from her, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, the brandy glass cradled between his palms. For several long moments he studied the amber liquid as if it might provide the courage he needed to continue. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the crackling of burning logs and the distant sounds of celebration continuing in the ballroom. "Do you remember Lady Catherine Pemberton?" Marcus finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "She served as your lady-in-waiting about 15 years ago, before she married and moved to the countryside." Isabella's memory stirred, bringing forth the image of a striking brunette with intelligent brown eyes and a quick smile. Catherine had been efficient, discreet, and well-liked by the entire household staff. Her departure to marry a country gentleman had seemed natural at the time, though Isabella recalled feeling surprised by the suddenness of the decision. "Of course I remember Catherine. She was wonderful, very capable. Why are you asking about her now?" Isabella's voice remained steady, though warning bells were beginning to sound in her mind. Marcus set down his glass and looked directly at her. For the first time since she had entered the room, his blue eyes, which had once gazed at her with complete adoration, now held a mixture of guilt, pain, and something that looked remarkably like relief at finally approaching the truth. "Because 15 years ago, Catherine and I had an affair," he said quietly. "It lasted for several months, and when it ended, she left the palace to start a new life away from the complications we had created." The words hit Isabella like physical blows. She felt her carefully constructed world beginning to tilt on its axis, familiar landmarks suddenly appearing foreign and threatening. Her hands gripped the arms of the leather chair as she struggled to process the magnitude of what he had just revealed. "An affair," she repeated slowly, tasting the words as if they were in a foreign language. "While she was working in our home, caring for our children, serving our family, you were..." She couldn't finish the sentence, the betrayal too enormous to articulate fully. "Isabella, please understand, it wasn't planned. It didn't happen because I loved you any less or because our marriage was lacking. It was a moment of weakness that spiraled beyond my control before I found the strength to end it." Marcus's explanation sounded rehearsed, as if he had practiced these words countless times in preparation for this moment. She stood abruptly, her royal composure cracking as anger began to rise like a tide within her chest. "A moment of weakness? Marcus, affairs don't just happen. They're built on dozens of choices, hundreds of small betrayals, countless opportunities to stop and remember your vows, your family, your responsibilities." The king rose as well, reaching toward her in a gesture of reconciliation that she immediately stepped away from. His face showed genuine remorse, but Isabella was beyond caring about his emotional state. The foundation of her entire adult life had just been revealed as a carefully constructed lie. "You're right, and I've regretted those choices every single day since then," Marcus continued, his voice gaining strength as if confession was providing some form of relief. "I ended the relationship because I realized what I was risking." Catherine understood, and she agreed that distance was the best solution for everyone involved. "Everyone involved?" Isabella echoed with bitter irony. "And what about me, Marcus? What about the woman who believed in you, who supported your reign, who raised your children, while you were creating complications with her staff? Was I involved in this decision? Or was I simply another problem to be managed?" The firelight cast dancing shadows across their faces as they stood on opposite sides of the room, the physical distance between them seeming to represent the emotional chasm that had opened with his revelation. Isabella's mind raced through memories of 15 years ago, searching for signs she had missed, clues that might have warned her of the deception being practiced under her own roof. "But that's not the only reason I needed to tell you tonight," Marcus continued, his voice growing even quieter. "Catherine sent word today. She's coming to the capital tomorrow, and she's bringing someone with her." Isabella's blood turned to ice as the implication of his words became clear. "Someone," she repeated, the word hanging in the air between them like an unexploded bomb. Marcus nodded slowly, confirming her worst fears. Her 14-year-old son. Our son, Isabella. I have another child, and tomorrow, for the first time, I'm going to meet him. The room seemed to spin around Isabella as the full scope of the deception became clear. Not only had her husband betrayed their marriage vows, but that betrayal had produced a child who had been living in secret for 14 years. She gripped the back of the chair to steady herself, as waves of shock, anger, and heartbreak crashed over her in rapid succession. The sounds of the harvest celebration continued to drift through the palace walls, a stark reminder that while her world was collapsing, the kingdom continued its traditions, unaware that their royal family was fragmenting in the shadows of the blue study. Isabella stood frozen in the blue study, her mind struggling to process the enormity of Marcus's revelation. A child, a 14-year-old son she had never known existed. The betrayal cut deeper than she had imagined possible, reaching into the very core of who she believed herself to be as a wife, mother, and queen. 14 years, she whispered, her voice barely audible. For 14 years, you've known you had another son, and you said nothing. While I worried about Alexander's future as heir, while I celebrated Victoria's achievements, while I supported every decision you made as king and father, you were hiding an entire family from me. Marcus moved toward his desk, pulling out a leather folder that had been hidden in the locked drawer. His movements were careful and deliberate, as if he had rehearsed this moment many times. Catherine sent these, he said, removing several photographs and placing them on the desk surface. His name is James Pemberton. Despite her anger and shock, Isabella found herself drawn to the photographs. She approached the desk slowly, her heart pounding as she prepared to see the face of her husband's secret son. The image that greeted her was like looking at a ghost from the past. The boy had Marcus's distinctive blue eyes and strong jawline, but softened by what must have been Catherine's gentler features. He was handsome in the way royal children often were, carrying himself with an unconscious dignity that spoke of good breeding and careful upbringing. He looks like Alexander did at that age, Isabella observed, her voice hollow with the recognition of undeniable family resemblance. The pain of seeing Marcus's features reflected in another woman's child felt like a knife twisting in her chest. Catherine has done well by him, Marcus said quietly, watching Isabella's reaction carefully. She married a good man, Henry Pemberton, who has raised James as his own son. The boy doesn't know about me, about his true parentage. Catherine and I agreed it was better that way, to protect him from the complications of royal life. Isabella laughed bitterly, a sound devoid of any warmth or humor. How noble of you both, making decisions about what was best for everyone, while the one person who should have been consulted remained completely ignorant. Tell me, Marcus, how many other secrets are you hiding? How many other children might be living in the countryside under assumed names? There are no others, Marcus replied firmly. Catherine was a mistake, a moment when I lost sight of everything that truly mattered. It was the only time I was unfaithful to you, Isabella. I swear that on everything I hold sacred. Your sacred oaths don't seem to carry much weight, Isabella shot back, her composure finally beginning to crack under the pressure of accumulated betrayals. You swore to forsake all others when we married. You swore to honor and protect our family. You've broken every meaningful promise you ever made to me. She began pacing the room like a caged animal, her sapphire gown rustling with agitation. The elegant study that had witnessed countless important decisions in the kingdom's history now felt like a courtroom where her entire marriage was being put on trial and found guilty of fundamental fraud. Why now? She demanded, turning to face him with blazing eyes. Why tell me this tonight after all these years? What's changed that suddenly makes honesty seem necessary? Marcus ran his hands through his hair again, a gesture that spoke of exhaustion and desperation. Because James is asking questions about his parentage. Catherine says he's always felt different from Henry, despite the love and care he's received. He's been researching his background, and Catherine is afraid he'll discover the truth on his own if we don't address it directly. And what exactly are you proposing to address? Isabella's voice rose slightly before she caught herself, and returned to the controlled tones expected of a queen. Are you planning to acknowledge him publicly? Bring him to court? Perhaps add him to the line of succession? I don't know, Marcus admitted, his honest confusion somehow making the situation even more painful. Catherine requested a private meeting to discuss options. She's not asking for money or recognition. She simply wants to explore what might be best for James as he approaches adulthood and begins making decisions about his future. Isabella moved to the window where Marcus had been standing when she arrived. The gardens below looked peaceful and orderly, maintained by staff who understood their roles and performed their duties without creating dynasties of deception. How simple life seemed when viewed from this distance. How manageable compared to the chaos that had erupted in this room. "And what about our children?" she asked, her reflection in the glass showing a woman who had aged a decade in the span of an hour. "Alexander is heir to the throne. His claim, his preparation, his entire identity has been built around being your eldest son. What happens when he learns he might have an older brother?" "James is several months younger than Alexander," Marcus replied. "Catherine's pregnancy was confirmed after Alexander's birth, though I didn't learn about it until much later." "How convenient for the succession," Isabella said with bitter sarcasm. "But that doesn't address the fundamental question. Our children deserve to know they have a half-brother. Victoria deserves to understand why her mother is suddenly questioning everything she believed about her family. They deserve honesty, even if we've decided they can't handle it." Marcus moved to stand behind her, though he was careful not to touch her. His reflection appeared beside hers in the window. Two people who had shared nearly 3 decades together now seeming like strangers meeting for the first time. "I was hoping we could handle this quietly without disrupting the children's lives or creating a scandal that could damage the monarchy," he said. "The kingdom's stability depends on people's faith in our institutions. A revelation like this could undermine everything we've worked to build." Isabella turned to face him directly, her green eyes blazing with a fury that had been building for weeks. "The kingdom's stability depends on truth and honor, not on elaborate deceptions maintained by people who have forgotten the meaning of both words. You're asking me to participate in another lie, to help you manage another cover-up, to prioritize political convenience over basic human decency. I'm asking you to help me navigate an impossible situation," Marcus replied, his own frustration beginning to show. "I made a terrible mistake 15 years ago, but I cannot change the past. I can only try to minimize the damage to everyone involved." "Everyone involved," Isabella repeated, her voice growing dangerously quiet. "Let me be very clear about something, Marcus. I am not involved in this situation. I am a victim of it. I am the woman whose marriage has been based on a fundamental lie, whose trust has been shattered, whose role as mother has been compromised by the existence of a child she was never told about." She moved toward the door, her decision crystallizing with each step. "You will meet with Catherine and James tomorrow, and you will make whatever arrangements your conscience demands, but you will do it without my participation, without my blessing, and without any expectation that I will help you manage the consequences of your choices." "Isabella, please," Marcus called after her, desperation clear in his voice. "We can work through this together. Our marriage has survived other challenges. We can find a way forward that protects everyone." She paused with her hand on the door handle, not turning around. "Our marriage survived other challenges because they were challenges we faced together, honest difficulties that we addressed as partners. This is not a challenge, Marcus. This is a betrayal so fundamental that it calls into question every assumption I've made about who we are as a couple and as a family." "What are you saying?" Marcus asked quietly. Isabella finally turned to look at him one last time, her expression a mixture of grief and determination that left no doubt about the finality of her decision. "I'm saying that tomorrow you will meet your son, and I will begin deciding whether our marriage can survive the revelation of who you really are." With that, she opened the door and stepped into the corridor, leaving Marcus alone with his photographs and his regrets, while the sounds of celebration continued to echo through the palace halls, a mockery of the devastation that had just unfolded in the blue study. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Isabella's private sitting room as she reviewed official correspondence with mechanical precision. 3 days had passed since Marcus's devastating revelation, and the palace had settled into an uneasy rhythm of maintained appearances and careful distances. The public remained unaware of the crisis brewing within the royal family, though Isabella suspected the more observant members of the household staff had begun noticing the subtle changes in their routines. Lady Margaret entered quietly with the morning tea service, her discreet presence a welcome comfort in the isolation Isabella had created for herself. "Your Majesty, King Marcus has requested an audience at your convenience," she said carefully, avoiding any indication of the dramatic shift in royal dynamics that had occurred. "Tell His Majesty that I am reviewing applications for the Queen's Scholarship Fund and will be available after lunch," Isabella replied without looking up from her papers. The formality felt like armor, protecting her from emotions she wasn't yet ready to fully confront. The meeting with Catherine and James had taken place as planned, though Isabella had remained pointedly absent. Through Lady Margaret's discreet inquiries among the staff, she had learned that the encounter had been emotional and complicated. Catherine had grown into an elegant woman who carried herself with quiet dignity, while James possessed an unmistakable royal bearing despite his humble upbringing in the countryside. Prince Alexander appeared in the doorway, his usually confident demeanor replaced by obvious concern. "Mother, may I come in? There's something I need to discuss with you." His formal request for entry into what had always been an open space for him indicated that he sensed the gravity of current family circumstances. "Of course, darling," Isabella said, setting aside her papers and giving him her full attention. Alexander had always been perceptive, and she suspected he had noticed the tension between his parents over recent days. He settled into the chair across from her, his posture reflecting the weight of royal responsibility he carried as heir to the throne. "Father spoke with Victoria and me yesterday. He told us about James, about the choices he made 15 years ago, and about the meeting that took place." His voice was steady, but Isabella could see the emotional storm brewing behind his composed exterior. Isabella felt her carefully maintained composure waver slightly. She had hoped to have more time to process her own feelings before addressing the impact on her children. "And how are you handling this news?" she asked gently. "I'm trying to understand how something so significant could have remained hidden for so long," Alexander replied honestly. "I'm angry at Father for the deception, confused about what this means for our family, and concerned about you, Mother. This must be devastating for you." His maturity and empathy touched Isabella deeply, reminding her of the remarkable young man she and Marcus had raised together. Despite everything, they had succeeded in nurturing children with strong moral foundations and genuine compassion for others. "It has been difficult," Isabella admitted, allowing herself a moment of vulnerability with her son. "I'm still trying to process the full implications of what your father has told me. My primary concern right now is ensuring that you and Victoria have the support you need to handle this situation." Alexander leaned forward, his blue eyes intense with the passion that would serve him well as a future leader. "Mother, I want you to know that regardless of what happens between you and Father, Victoria and I stand with you completely. Your grace, your dedication to this family and this kingdom, your unwavering integrity, these are the foundations of who we are as people and as royals." Tears threatened for the first time since that devastating night in the Blue Study. Isabella had been so focused on her own pain that she hadn't fully considered how her children's loyalty and love could provide strength during this crisis. "Thank you, Alexander. That means more to me than you can possibly know. There's something else," Alexander continued, his expression growing more troubled. "Victoria and I have been discussing the situation, and we both agree that James deserves to know the truth about his parentage, regardless of the complications it might create. He's our half-brother, and he has a right to understand his heritage." Isabella nodded slowly, recognizing the wisdom and ethical clarity that characterized both of her children. "And what about the implications for the monarchy?" "Your father is concerned about protecting institutional stability. The monarchy's strength comes from the character of the people who represent it, not from carefully maintained secrets," Alexander replied with conviction. "If we build our legacy on deception, what kind of institution are we really protecting?" Before Isabella could respond, Princess Victoria entered the room with her characteristic energy, though her usual bright smile was tempered by obvious concern. "Mother, Alexander, I hope I'm not interrupting something important." We were discussing the family situation, Alexander explained as Victoria settled onto the small sofa near the fireplace. Good, because I have thoughts about that, Victoria said, her directness providing a different but equally valuable perspective. I met James briefly yesterday when he was leaving Father's study. Mother, he's remarkable. Despite growing up without knowing about his royal heritage, he carries himself with natural dignity and shows genuine concern for how his existence might impact our family. Isabella was struck by her daughter's immediate acceptance and positive assessment of the half-brother she had just discovered. Victoria's generous spirit had always been one of her most admirable qualities, and it was fully on display in her response to this challenging situation. He asked specifically about you, Victoria continued. James was worried that his presence might cause you pain, and he wanted to make sure that any future contact would be respectful of your feelings and position as queen. This consideration from a boy she had never met moved Isabella profoundly. Despite the circumstances of his birth and the secrecy surrounding his existence, James appeared to have been raised with values that honored family relationships and understood the complexities of royal life. What are your thoughts about moving forward? Isabella asked her children, genuinely curious about their perspectives on managing an unprecedented family situation. Alexander and Victoria exchanged glances before Alexander spoke. We think James should be acknowledged as our half-brother privately, within the family. We'd like to develop a relationship with him that doesn't necessarily require public announcement, but allows us to be honest about our connections. And we think you should make whatever decisions feel right for your marriage and your future, without worrying about how they might affect us, Victoria added firmly. Alexander and I are adults, and we can handle whatever consequences arise from Father's choices. Your happiness and well-being are what matter most to us. Isabella felt overwhelmed by the wisdom and maturity her children were displaying. In the space of a few days, they had processed earth-shattering news, made thoughtful decisions about family relationships, and prioritized her emotional welfare above their own concerns about public perception or royal protocol. There's something else you should know, Alexander said quietly. Father has asked James and Catherine to stay in the capital for several more days. He wants to explore options for James's education and future, including the possibility of university preparation that would be appropriate for someone of his intelligence and background. And how do you feel about that? Isabella asked. We support it completely, Victoria replied without hesitation. James didn't choose the circumstances of his birth, but he deserves every opportunity to develop his potential. If Father can provide educational advantages or career guidance, it seems like the least he can do after 14 years of absence. Isabella stood and moved to the window, looking out at the gardens where she had spent so many peaceful hours over the years. The view remained unchanged, but her perspective on everything within those palace walls had been fundamentally altered. Her children's wisdom and loyalty provided hope that the family could navigate this crisis with integrity intact, even if the final configuration looked different from what she had always expected. Your father wants to discuss our path forward, Isabella said finally, turning back to face Alexander and Victoria. I think I'm ready for that conversation now. Whatever you decide, Mother, we'll support you completely, Alexander assured her. And remember that love takes many forms, Victoria added with a gentle smile. Whether you and Father find a way to rebuild your marriage or decide that honesty requires a different kind of relationship, what matters is that everyone involved can live with dignity and authenticity. As Isabella prepared for the most important conversation of her adult life, she felt strengthened by the knowledge that she had raised children capable of handling complex moral situations with grace and wisdom. Whatever the future held for the royal family of Ravenshollow, it would be built on foundations of truth, respect, and genuine love for one another. The crown might be heavy, but it rested on heads worthy of its weight.